Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of The Damage Report. I'm John Adarola. We have got so much to get to, so many people to get to, actually, because throughout the course of this hour, I'm going to be joined by 3 different guests in just a little bit. Actually, on the other side of the upcoming break, progressive activist Jordan Uhl is going to be joining us to break down some of the big news stories of the day, including the New York Times headline gate. That's a real doozy. Whose side is the New York Times on? They want you to believe the truth, but it's not always so clear from their headlines. Other news as well. Parker Molloy of Media Matters is going to be joining us once again to break down another right-wing grifter, this time in the particular area of making up fake progressives that supposedly committed terror attacks. This is something one person did multiple times, and so we'll be giving the details on that. As well as later on the show, David Dennis Jr. will be returning to the show to break down his recent op-ed about the shootings over the weekend and his perception of some of the components of it that we should be focusing on at this time. We'll be closing out the show with another threat against Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Seems like we can't go a week without somebody making some sort of violent or sexual threat against her. This time it happened at a senator's rally, and we'll be giving you those details in just a little bit. But before we get to all that, we do want to touch base with our president and his thoughts about the shootings of the weekend and who exactly should be blamed. Yesterday on the show, we said that Donald Trump was oddly unfired up over the terror attacks over the weekend, but it turned out we just needed to wait because he did get fired up. Not about the violence or about doing anything about it, but about Barack Obama, who put out a statement about the shootings and appeared simply by his existence far more presidential than Donald Trump could ever hope to be. And because you have both that and Donald Trump being criticized for his rhetoric, which can contribute to these sorts of attacks, he lashed out against the former president. And his weapon of choice was Brian Kilmeade. He quoted Kilmeade from this morning's Fox and Friends saying, "Did George Bush ever condemn President Obama after Sandy Hook? President Obama had 32 mass shootings during his reign. Not many people said Obama is out of control. Mass shootings were happening before the president even thought about running for prez." So that was Brian Kilmeade, who, well, let's just brief little side note, said on the show this morning that he will continue to call the immigration situation we're currently experiencing an invasion, even though the El Paso terrorist used invasion and replacement theory language, even though the Tree of Life terrorist used invasion language. Brian Kilmeade loves the term so much, who cares if it inspires terror attacks? He's gonna keep using it. But with that, we'll return to Donald Trump. So why was Donald Trump so fired up about this? Why was Brian Kilmeade so fired up about this? Well, it's because of Obama's statement yesterday. And so I wanna read just a couple of short sections from it. Former President Barack Obama said, throughout his 8-year tenure, the former president, oh, sorry, this is out of order, unfortunately. We should soundly reject language coming out of the mouths of any of our leaders that feeds a climate of fear and hatred or normalizes racist sentiments, leaders who demonize those who don't look like us, or suggest that other people, including immigrants, threaten our way of life, or refer to other people as subhuman, or imply that America belongs to just one certain type of people. And so, yeah, if you're Trump, you're not gonna like that. Not because it's inaccurate, but because it's about you, and he's a small little baby person, and he doesn't take criticism well. The former president goes on to say, such language isn't new. It's been at the root of most human tragedy throughout history, here in America and around the world. It has no place in our politics and our public life. And it's time for the overwhelming majority of Americans of goodwill, or every race and faith and political party, to say as much, clearly and unequivocally. Now, Donald Trump did say some things in the neighborhood of what Obama was calling for in his statements yesterday. That's true. It was sort of out of character for Donald Trump in the right direction. Now, yes, he did get the location of one of the terror attacks wrong. It was fumbling and weird, and obviously he hadn't written the words in the teleprompter. He hadn't read them previously, and his heart most certainly wasn't in them. But he did say somewhat the right thing. He blamed all the wrong things, and we'll be returning to that later on in the show. But the issue is that Donald Trump didn't come into existence when he stepped in front of that podium yesterday. He's been talking for a long time, and he's been saying all the wrong things. And so Donald Trump is frustrated that the former president is criticizing him. That's why he said, why didn't George W. Bush criticize Barack Obama? That's because the situations are different. It's not hypocritical if they're fundamentally different. And here's the problem. Donald Trump has been attacking Mexicans specifically and Mexican Americans since he descended down that golden escalator. He's been doing it constantly. It was not just the centerpiece of his 2016 campaign. It was multiple centerpieces of his campaign, and he's returned to it constantly ever since then. He has used violent rhetoric both towards that group. He's joked, he's laughed when people have talked about shooting them. He's called into question the loyalty of any Mexican American. He's joked about his followers punching protesters out and saying he would pay their legal fees. I mean, we could go through any number of these different things. Hell, we could just go through a couple of weeks ago when he said that any Congress people from outside of this country should probably be sent back where they belong. He picked an unnecessary racist feud with Representative Cummings. I mean, we don't have to go back that far. Caravans seem to pop up every time he gets excited about the immigration situation, mysteriously posing a threat when it's politically convenient for him. All of that needs to be borne in mind when you're deciding, is there a link between this terror attack and what Donald Trump has said and done? Now, there's far better researchers than I have already drawn direct parallels between particular Trump comments and particular components of the El Paso terrorist manifesto. It's all there. If you would like to make the case that Barack Obama is similarly responsible for things like Sandy Hook and other attacks that took place while he was president, feel free to do that. He was president for 8 years. He gave any number of public addresses. Draw the lines if they're there. Use the evidence that you assert is there, but refuse to actually find. That's what's missing here when people try to both sides this political violence. Now, in the case of this weekend, just as a small aside, we have the El Paso terrorist who drove across Texas because he wanted to kill Mexicans. Mexicans have of course been a big part of Donald Trump's rhetoric, as well as any number of right-wing politicians and right-wing commentators on things like Breitbart and Fox News and stuff like that. Now, similarly, people are getting all hot and bothered about the fact that the Ohio terrorist apparently held some left-wing views or supported some left-wing politicians. Now, if you're uncomfortable about what's been going on in El Paso, if you don't like the fact that this is shining a light on American conservatism and the link with it and political violence, then I understand why you would want to jump on the Ohio terrorist and say, it's all the same, we're all to blame. But here's the thing, you need to actually do the job of showing the connection there. It's unfortunate but true that literally everyone who commits a crime, everyone who commits a murder, everyone who commits a mass shooting probably supports some politicians and doesn't support others. But we can't simply say that they have a political motivation just because they have preferences. We need to show a logical cause and effect connection between the beliefs they had and why they committed the terror attack. So the guy in Ohio supposedly liked Elizabeth Warren. If you want to say that supporting Elizabeth Warren is linked with the terror attack he committed, then show me the statements, bring the receipts. What did Elizabeth Warren say that can reasonably lead to a person committing a terror attack? It's just not there. And honestly, they're not even trying to make that connection. They believe that him having liked a politician is enough. In El Paso, the connection is right there. There are any number of statements that you've seen on Fox News, that you've seen in Donald Trump's speeches that directly compare those two things. If you want to both sides, you're gonna have to do a little bit of research. And so in the same way that Trump is trying to do that with Obama, others are trying to do it with the 2 terror attacks from the weekend. And I think that considering the cost, considering the lives that have already been lost, the lives that might well be lost in the future, this is no time for fact-free both sidesing. Okay, we are going to take a short break. When we come back, Jordan Yule's gonna be joining us to break down some more news of the day after this.
We need to talk about a relatively new show called the Republic, or UNFTR. As a Young Turks fan, you already know that the government, the media, and corporations are constantly peddling lies that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. But now there's a podcast dedicated to unraveling those lies, debunking the conventional wisdom. In each episode of the Republic, or UNFTR, the host delves into a different historical episode or topic that's generally misunderstood or purposely obfuscated by the so-called powers that be. Featuring in-depth research, razor-sharp commentary, and just the right amount of vulgarity, the UNFTR podcast takes a sledgehammer to what you thought you knew about some of the nation's most sacred historical cows. But don't just take my word for it. The New York Times described UNFTR as consistently compelling and educational, aiming to challenge conventional wisdom and upend the historical narratives that were taught in school. For as the great philosopher Yoda once put it, "You must unlearn what you have learned." And that's true whether you're in Jedi training or you're uprooting and exposing all the propaganda and disinformation you've been fed over the course of your lifetime. So search for UNFDR in your podcast app today and get ready to get informed, angered, and entertained all at the same time.
The New York Times is the last bastion of truth. It's the paper of record, or at least that's how it's branded. And they do indeed do some good investigative journalism, but man, do they really drop the ball when it comes to some of their headlines. Take a look at the one we've got over here. Trump urges unity versus racism. So that's not technically untrue when describing Donald Trump's statements from yesterday. But if you widen your analysis even an inch farther than that, and take a look at what he has actually done, what he's actually said. It is absurd to pitch Donald Trump's contribution to the current crisis we're experiencing as him urging unity against racism. But indeed, that's what they did, and a lot of people took issue with it, including Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who said, let this front page serve as a reminder of how white supremacy is aided by and often relies upon the cowardice of mainstream institutions. Joining us now to talk about the cowardice of mainstream institutions, progressive activist Jordan Ewell. Welcome back to the Damage Report.
Thanks for having me, John.
Great to have you here. So that's the New York Times. That's their front page headline. What did you think about that?
So I thought this headline was shameful. We did see the executive editor, Dean Baquet, came out and apologized and said they were wrong. He said they were rushed. They were up against a deadline. I mean, if you worked in news, this is, it's like, sure, deadlines can be pressing, but there's no excuse for it to begin with, because the story really didn't, it was like, somewhat skeptical of Trump's sincerity on this issue. So it didn't really even fit the story. Yes. But this shows like the willingness and way over eager willingness by mainstream and legacy media outlets to give Trump the benefit of the doubt on this stuff and completely ignore all the historical context like you just mentioned.
Yeah. So before we do more commentary on this, I do want to say that they did they got the criticism. They came out with a second headline. Let's see if we like this better. It's this was tweeted by Tom Jolly, assailing hate but not guns, which again is not untrue about his remarks. He did criticize hate and didn't really talk about guns, but it's pitching him as a person who assails hate, and that still seems pretty fundamentally inaccurate to me.
Right. Trump, from day one of his campaign, he has weaponized hateful rhetoric against immigrants, against Latinx people. Throughout his presidency, he has been extremely malicious in how he represents and talks about people of color, immigrants, marginalized communities, women. All of these marginalized groups seem to be subject to an increased level of scrutiny and attack from Trump, whereas a white Christian man would not. So when you have this, and then you also have this shooter in El Paso who was clearly motivated by rhetoric forwarded by Trump and other right-wing outlets, talking about this invasion of immigrants across the border. Yeah. And this is a white nationalist and white supremacist conspiracy theory, this great replacement theory. We've seen this forwarded by people like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham. Trump has tweeted extensively about this invasion of immigrants. This is what motivated the shooter. So you see a direct parallel between his beliefs and Trump's rhetoric. So for the New York Times and other outlets to just take Trump at his word on this when he assails hate and condemns this type of hate, it's completely ahistorical. It's looking at this issue only in a vacuum, and it's journalistic malfeasance.
So one more question about that, because you talked about their sort of willingness to give the benefit of the doubt to the president. So I really want to know, is this like them being too much like Obama, like constantly reaching out their hand when it's not justified? Is it cowardice? Is it a business decision? Is this some sort of financial calculation? Why, especially when, as you rightly point out, it doesn't even reflect the content of the articles, and there's sort of anonymous word from inside of the New York Times that the reporters are frustrated with this sort of thing continually happening. How do we explain why they keep making this same sort of mistake?
The first thing we need to talk about is diversifying newsrooms. When you have an overwhelmingly white newsroom like the New York Times, these errors are bound to continually happen. When you have a more diverse, more representative spectrum of viewpoints and interests and ideas in a newsroom, you could very easily mitigate these types of errors. Secondly, I mean, you need to be way more critical of Trump. I think a lot of outlets and reporters are on the defensive because of his attacks. They're so like concerned that they're going to upset him and lose access, which would then lead to losing stories and scoops. And could hurt their business model. So part of that is also having a for-profit enterprise in journalism. So we need to talk about a systemic issue of for-profit journalism across the board, and also diversity in newsrooms.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn to another aspect of this story, and that is you saw in that headline there that assailing hate but not guns, and that was pretty common across a lot of the media and most of the politicians. Pretty much everything aside from guns was blamed yesterday for those terror attacks. I want to show a short video clip from yesterday about one of the avenues of attack.
You want to see from these individuals what they wrote in others, but I mean, this may be a place that we could find this ahead of time. There may be a place of what's being written can be changed, could be an indication that an individual needs help in others that we can stop. But the idea of these video games to dehumanize individuals, to have a game of shooting individuals and others, I've always felt that is a problem for future generations and others. We've watched from studies shown before of what it does to individuals. When you look at these photos of how it took place, you can see the actions within video games and others.
So that was House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy blaming video games, lying about the studies. The studies, in fact, don't show that. And I feel like we're qualified to talk about this because I'm a long-time gamer. I believe you've recently been playing Fortnite, Jordan, is that correct?
Yeah, Fortnite, but I still play Halo 5, man. I can't
there
put
you
that
go.
game down.
So you play these games, including games where you're shooting people, and yet you've never gone on a shooting spree, at least as far as I know. So what do you think about this, again, going back to the focusing on video games?
It's a complete distraction. To blame video games is just, it's an obfuscation tactic. It completely ignores that video games exist in other countries as well, and they don't have the levels of gun violence in other countries. We are a complete outlier when it comes to this issue. You look at any data set, the amount of shootings per year in any other country, the United States is way off the charts compared to anybody else. In most countries, it's single digits, and we are in the hundreds of shootings every year. So to blame it on video games is a distraction, especially when it comes from people like the right who are taking in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from the gun lobby. They represent the interests of the gun manufacturers, the NRA. This is just a complete distraction. Do not believe it.
Yeah, and so you point out rightly that video games are played all around the world. In some countries, they're far more popular per capita than they are in the US, and they don't have those sorts of shootings. But inside of the US as well, you hear about video games not whenever there's a mass shooting, but when there's a mass shooting of a particular kind, and that is a white male. If, in the case that it's a Muslim guy who commits a mass shooting, does he not play video games? They're pretty popular. If an African-American person in the US commits some sort of crime, they don't go to the video games. It's always something more fundamental. There's no excuse. It's always something fundamentally wrong about them. And that's why we need to ban them from the country. But for some reason, when it's a white male, it's gotta be they've been corrupted by these damn electronics. But video games were not the only thing that were blamed. What else did you notice when you're following the media yesterday?
So video games were one distraction or cause. They also alleged it was mental health, and this is another one that pundits and across the board like to point to as well, because I think society is not ready for a conversation on gun reform and gun violence in the country, because it would cause a lot of introspection, and a lot of people don't want to do that. So they just chalk it up to mental illness. And again, this is another distraction, because most people who suffer from mental illness are more likely to hurt themselves or be victims of violence. And if you talk about mental illness and any sort of gun violence capacity, it's suicide. Guns account for half of the suicides every year as the cause or how they executed themselves. So you have this mental health issue in a suicide capacity, but no one is willing to address the role of guns on a systemic level in that. So you have people blaming mental illness, ignoring that people who are depressed, who even suffer from bipolar disorder or other mental health illnesses, aren't really the ones going out there and hurting other people. It's people who are just inherently violent, people who have a violence issue within them. And that's not the same as being depressed or being anxious.
Yeah. So I want to play devil's advocate just briefly. Let's say that they're being authentic when they make it about mental health. I believe that they're wrong, but maybe they honestly believe that this is the problem. In that case, over the past 2 years of them having the White House, what have they done? Do we know of any efforts that prove that they are authentically concerned about mental health and guns?
Right. If that's the biggest concern, exactly to your point, what are they doing? We see nothing on a systemic and on a reform level. They want to acknowledge that this problem exists, and if they are, like you said, if they are being sincere in this hypothetical, it exists on a major scale, and it's a national issue. Like we at Media Matters, we've compiled people like well-known right-wing pundits, their comments blaming mental health, with one of them calling it a national security issue. If that's the case, what are you calling for? What are your solutions? Do you want to see an uptick in investment in mental health resources? Do you want to see that in schools? But we don't get there when it comes to brass tacks and we talk about solutions. We have people like Sean Hannity saying they want to put cops and vets and more armed guards in every school. So the solution to them always involves more guns.
Yeah, and I mean the $1 million question is, if you are going to take mental health seriously, at what point do you take away a person's guns? I mean, we know the answer to that, at no point. I mean, I guess we should be concerned about this person, but we should leave them armed. Similarly, if the solution is to just have more people walking around with guns so that you always have a good guy with a gun, at what point does the good guy act? If he sees someone in an Arby's with an AR-15, does he do something? Does he just watch? If the guy takes out the gun and just holds it, that's his legal right. Should you shoot him at that point? Or are you only supposed to step in as a good guy with a gun once the bullets are actually flying? It's utter chaos, it's distractions when we know what is truly causing this. Exactly. Let's turn to another topic from this morning. Donald Trump is going to war with Google apparently, while also sort of covering himself with a new sort of social media focused right-wing conspiracy theory. He tweeted this earlier. Sundar Pichai of Google was in the Oval Office working very hard to explain how much he liked me, what a great job the administration is doing, that Google was not involved with China's military, that they didn't help crooked Hillary over me in the 2016 election, and that they are not planning to illegally subvert the 2020 election despite all that has been said to the contrary. It all sounded good until I watched Kevin Cernicki, a Google engineer, say terrible things about what they did in 2016, and that they want to, quote, make sure that Trump losses in 2020. So he's gonna be watching Google very closely because of all this. So that name has come up before in right-wing media. What should we know about this story?
So Kevin Cernicki has been making the rounds in right-wing media over the past few days and about the last week. He claims that he has been fired from Google for being a conservative. Nobody in the right wing thought to check that claim. So he went on. He did the rounds. He was profiled in the Wall Street Journal. He went on Tucker Carlson's show, and nobody really did any fact checking who this guy is, what he might be interested in. As it turns out, this Kevin Cernicki guy has been promoting various white nationalists and various white supremacist groups, most notably defending Richard Spencer, the white supremacist white nationalist, after he was punched on Inauguration Day. He also defended a group called the Golden State Skinheads and offered his thoughts online on a forum about how they could rebrand to help preserve the white nationalist movement in California and across the country. So this is a guy with alleged ties to white supremacist and white nationalist groups, and he clearly had a falling out in Google because of that. His colleague or former colleagues now have gone public with this after they saw he was making the rounds and getting all this publicity and being portrayed as a martyr. It's like, wait a second, no, this guy is actually reprehensible. But because of the way this infrastructure works, and again, as we talked about on the show before, Trump's reliance on Fox News for his information, Trump took that as gospel and is now parroting this guy's claims that Google worked against Trump and now has tried to suppress negative stories about Hillary Clinton.
See, that is what people need to know. It's not particularly complex, but it does leave us with some additional questions like, what is Donald Trump doing spreading this guy's message? Just a couple of days after a white nationalist commits a horrific terror attack, he is jumping out to help a guy who has personally defended white nationalists. I think that should be the story, not the idea that Google is committing treason against the United States. In any event, Jordan, we always love to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, John.
We're lots more to get to. Stick around. As we've talked about a number of times, there is this attempt to both sides political violence, and so there is a big audience for just tell me a left-winger did this one. And they will believe someone even if that person has a documented history of making up fake leftists supposedly having perpetrated terror attacks. And joining us now to break down one of the best grifters in this area of the internet, that would be Parker Molloy, Media Matters editor-at-large.
Hi.
Welcome back to the show. So Jim Hoft, what is his grift? What's he about?
Okay, so Jim Hoft, he runs the website Gateway Pundit, which, if you're not familiar, it looks like a GeoCities page, and it's very poorly done, and the journalism matches. He tends to he's not a very good reporter, and doesn't really care so much about factual accuracy. So what happened in this case was, after the El Paso shooting, he published something saying that someone updated a page to say that the shooter was listed as a Democrat on a website, and that someone switched that to say Republican, and that just it just didn't happen. What happened was it was this website called mylife.com, which I guess autofills with publicly available information about people. And after the shooting, someone added Democrat to it. It was blank before that. So really all that anyone was doing was, after the shooting, they were going back and forth editing this page to try to make it seem like it was the quote unquote other side. It's one of those things that could have probably been easy to write off as just a mistake. Except for this is kind of what he does.
So this happened before.
So what we have on Media Matters, we have a list. There's several articles about Jim Hoft, and one of them is 20 plus times that he has been wrong about something, and he's gotten sued a couple times. You know, he accuses the wrong person in attacks based on weird Reddit hunches. Like he accused the wrong person in the Las Vegas shooting, and the wrong person in the Charlottesville attack. He claimed that the photo of the Cleveland Cavaliers NBA title parade in Cleveland was actually a photo outside of a Trump rally in a completely different state.
Well, to be fair, though,
he falls for protests or like hoaxes about paid protesters constantly.
Yeah. So I guess what we need to know then is, so he constantly gets things wrong, which is bad, but a little bit of that damage could be fixed if does he come out with corrections? Does he admit when he's wrong? So with the El Paso story, did he correct it to say, no, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that this guy is a hardcore right winger?
No, of course not. He at best, when he makes mistakes, he will delete posts, usually just without comment. But he's also one of those guys where he will, if the New York Times misspells someone's name and they have to run a correction, he will point to that and say, "See, fake news," which is sad and funny, and trying to rebut his lies is really tough, because the people who read those and see these points and then they follow them and believe them, these are not people who are honestly looking for information. These are people who are very motivated, have some very motivated reasoning driving them. So it's frustrating, and it's part of just a larger trend of misinformation out there, which, take that and then you add in stuff like actual media, organizations trying to both sides these situations, and it becomes a real headache, and it becomes hard to figure out what is going on.
Yeah, and there was today, I believe it is, CNN has an article about the left-wing views of the Ohio terrorists. And from the headline, it would seem like, oh, he was a leftist and that's why he committed the terror attack, when there's no evidence, at least as of right now, that implies that there was a connection there. Now, in the case of this guy, Jim Hoft, sometimes they just take an actual terrorist and they say this guy believes something that he didn't. In other cases, they misidentify and point the mob towards another person who wasn't even involved in the attack. There have been lawsuits before. They generally don't go anywhere. As you pointed out, he's being sued right now, as well as people like Alex Jones for similar sorts of things. Is there any reason to believe that these lawsuits might be more effective this time around?
Oh, I mean, I don't think so. Because honestly, what's been happening is not even his most egregious, mistakes over the years. And in the case of the person who, the shooter in El Paso, there's not too much sympathy for someone who committed, a murdered 22 people. That's not someone that anyone's going to go, how dare you besmirch his good name? Because obviously, obviously he's not. But there's also this idea that if someone is a Democrat or is a Republican, that scores points for someone. Honestly, if someone commits a crime and it's not driven by their ideology, it doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. But if someone writes a manifesto and says, I am committing this crime because I believe in this, if someone is a white nationalist and they really just want to, and they go and they mow down as many immigrants as they can find, like, obviously that is based on their political beliefs, their ideology. And that is when we have to really pay attention and keep an eye on how this, how these movements rise without getting any pushback or enough pushback.
Well, the pushback that is coming, thankfully, a lot of it is coming from Media Matters. So thank you for continuing to catalog these sorts of things like what Jim Hoft does and make sure that people have accurate information. Parker, as always, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back after this. Joining us now to break down some of the ways that perhaps we can learn something from this weekend's shootings, senior culture editor at Interactive One, David Dennis Jr. Welcome back to the Damage Report.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. I recently read your op-ed in News One, The Most American Day, where you talked about some of your thoughts coming out of those terror attacks. So I want to start off first. Why was that the most American day?
Well, in about a 24-hour span on a Saturday, we had what was pretty much a microcosm of the state of America right now. We have people in a town in Texas trying to live their lives and contribute to to America by buying school supplies for their kids, for the most part, and they were gunned down by white supremacists. In that same Walmart. And Walmart also, sort of represents one of the most American places you can be. It's a sign of capitalism. The CEO makes 1,000 times how much the median worker makes at Walmart. Walmart is also a place that has had to been dragged kicking and screaming into gun reform. It's a place that still sells guns in a lot of their stores. And you have unchecked white nationalist terror that is wreaking havoc on people that don't look like him. Also next door, you had an African-American Army service member who was saving children from the gun violence. And as he had hands full of children and was trying to get them to safety, police think that he's the shooter and he has to explain to them that he is innocent. And then when the night is over, after everybody is trying to catch their breath from this unspeakable terror that we see too often in this country, either they went to sleep or they woke up the next morning hearing about a shooting in Dayton, Ohio. So this is really the reality of America as we see it right now. This is Saturday. This is a day that we will, for the most part, a lot of people will forget in a week when the next shooting happens. And next year, we'll forget about that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned Glenn Oakley because in all of my reading about it, I had actually not seen a profile with much information about what he did on that day. And the fact that he was hassled, now thankfully he wasn't shot. The police were very restrained. They were able to take the shooter this time despite having killed all those people. They took him in. With certain types of shooters, they can always take him in. But it makes me think about the intersection of race with some of what a lot of right-wingers want. So they say that everybody should just have a gun so that we can have good guys with a gun. But what about certain types of good guys? What about African-American good guys at events like this? Are they going to have the same chance of being mistakenly shot by police if they try to defuse a situation or take out a terrorist?
Well, America, for the most part, has showed us that there's no such thing as a good guy, as a good black guy with a gun. That's not anything that we've learned in the history of this country and the history of the way that police treat us. I think back to Philando Castile in Minnesota a couple years ago who had a license to carry, who was pulled over by police who tried to show them that he had a legally obtained handgun, and he was killed. And the police have, for the most part, felt no repercussions for this action. So when we talk about good guys with guns, there's a certain type of good guy that we're talking about, and that good guy is a white good guy. So there's no such thing as black good guys with guns. As we've seen, this man was putting forth the most heroic thing you could possibly do, saving children from gunfire, and his life was as in danger coming across police as it was if he'd just stayed in Walmart.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but probably true. So since the attack, we've had a couple of days, and we've had Donald Trump has put out both a statement and a couple of tweets. As you've been sort of absorbing the events of the weekend, what did you think about what he's said?
Well, Donald Trump this is typical Trump. I mean, he is somebody who is taking the good with the bad and what is acceptable for him. And what is acceptable for him is reaching to his base. And, the fact of the matter is that there is no evidence that his base sees what happened in Walmart as that big of a tragedy. I mean, we've seen Trump at rallies in which people have yelled out, shoot immigrants, shoot people coming into this country, and he's laughed it off. Like, this is not, I'm not sure that this is something that Donald Trump sees as particularly tragic. He has shifted the blame to the media when the fact is this is all about the three most protected entities in this country, which is white men, guns, and white men with guns. And so Donald Trump has no motivation to stop any of that from happening.
I wanted to turn to some more tragic news. It's fairly breaking, just a little bit before we went live. And that was news that author Toni Morrison had passed away at 88. Obviously, both a beloved author and also the author of Beloved, but a Nobel Prize winner, Pulitzer Prize winner. How did you react to hearing of Toni Morrison's passing?
Toni Morrison's passing, something that sort of shook me to my core. It took me a while to really recover from the news. She is somebody, there are a lot of writers who would not be here if not for Toni Morrison. She is, quite frankly, one of the, if not the most important American writer we've ever had. She is somebody who spoke and speaks directly to African Americans. She's somebody who's made us feel loved. She's somebody who's made us feel as though we're important, we exist. She's loved us almost, to an extent that nobody else we could think of has a capacity to love us. Toni Morrison's loss is one that will take a long time to get over. But the benefit of all of this, the life that she lived, is that she has left so many jewels and pearls of wisdom and so many things to live by and so many ways that we can sort of honor her legacy. We really did not deserve 88 years of Toni Morrison.
And incredibly productive years, because she was writing just up until a couple of years ago with God Help the Child in 2015. I wanted to read just one line because I was reading a lot of both on Twitter, people talking about how she had impacted their lives, especially as writers. And I saw a quote from the Nobel Committee who said that she, who in novels characterized by visionary force and poetic import, gives life to an essential aspect of American reality. I just thought, geez, in all of my dreams of what I want to be as a writer, I've never even strove to achieve that, let alone actually achieved it over the course of much more than a half century of writing. So obviously a big loss.
Yeah, I mean, she is, rest in peace is really all I can say at this point.
Exactly. Well, David Dennis Jr., as always, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're gonna take one short break. We come back, another threat lodged against Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This one an implicit threat, and it took place at a senator's rally. These days, there's no one the right loves to hate more than Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's just constant attacks against her, and most of the time, it's just either disagreeing with her politically or even sort of unfairly attacking her intelligence or her looks or whatever. The sort of normal abuse that women have to endure every single day online. But a lot of the time, and increasingly, it goes into the area of actual threats, both against her life, the lives of the rest of the squad, but also particularly sexual threats as well. And normally it's like on billboards, online, the Border Patrol, their public forums, but sometimes it's in more official context. And take a look at this image. This apparently came at one of Senator Mitch McConnell's picnics. And you can see there, 7 young white men in Team Mitch t-shirts gathered around a distressed looking cardboard cutout of the representative, groping and kissing her. The caption reads, "Break me off a piece of that." And the person who wrote that said, "Future federal judges of America understand for context for that comment." In other images, those men at this picnic for Team Mitch are holding up big cutouts of the heads of Kavanaugh and Gorsuch as well. So you get an idea of what they think about that sort of influence on the judiciary. So they made a cutout of the representative, and they're kissing it, and they're groping it, and they're pointing at her genitals, because that's what politically active young Republicans apparently think is funny. She responded, of course, saying, "Hey, Senate Majority Leader, these young men look like they work for you. Just wanted to clarify, are you paying for young men to practice groping and choking members of Congress with your payroll, or is this just the standard culture of Team Mitch?" So she was right to call that out. I doubt that we're going to hear anything from him. Apparently, multiple journalists have already reached out to Mitch McConnell and his campaign, the organizers of that picnic, and they haven't heard anything back. I can't imagine why they would. His natural state is to stonewall. I have a feeling he will do that here as well. But yes, that was at the annual political picnic in McConnell's home state of Kentucky. Now understand, as horrific as that is, this is just the latest of this sort of threats. I alluded to it earlier, but back when we found out about that Facebook group that had thousands and thousands of members of Border Patrol, there were tons of horrifically racist comments, violent comments directed at members of Congress who might be visiting these facilities. But one set was in particular about AOC, and it was of a sexual nature. Perhaps the most disturbing posts target her in particular. One includes a photo illustration of her engaged in oral sex at an immigrant detention center. Text accompanying the image reads, "Lucky illegal immigrant glory hole special starring AOC." And so they can't help but attack her, and they also can't help but make it a sexually violent sort of attack that she, simply by being a woman in US government, has to endure on a constant basis. And Mitch McConnell has no influence over what happens in these private Facebook groups in the Border Patrol, but he does have an influence over the people that come to his events, the people who wear his shirts and potentially are working for his campaign. He can make clear whether or not they've ever actually been employed by the campaign. He can make clear that people who do those sorts of things will never be allowed to work for him or other members of the Republicans in the Senate. He could do that if he wanted to. He's had like 48 hours, he's chosen not to do that. But to be fair, perhaps he's a little bit distracted by other scandals that he is involved in, and that also took place at that picnic, because at that picnic, and bear in mind, that picnic was happening the same day as the terror attacks. In images posted just a couple of hours after that first attack in El Paso, his Team Mitch Twitter account posted this: "The Grim Reaper of socialism at Fancy Farm today." So yes, it is bizarre that he would choose to call himself the Grim Reaper, but in this particular way, it's even worse. Because although you can't really see too close there, socialism is one of the things on a tombstone there, but it's not just that. It's also Amy McGrath, who's running against him for Kentucky Senate coming up in this cycle. So the Grim Reaper is apparently going to bury his political opponent just hours after political violence perpetrated by a hard right winger. So that is what Team Mitch thought was appropriate, both to have at the picnic and also to spread. Isn't it funny on Twitter to joke about killing and burying your political opponents? That's funny. Isn't it funny to have a cutout of AOC so that the degenerates that follow you can grope it and choke it? Isn't that funny? Isn't Mitch McConnell just a fun young guy? But that's what they did. Amy McGrath, rightfully concerned, she posted a comment saying, "It's symptomatic of what is wrong with our system. I'm fine with the ordinary rough and tumble of politics, but this strikes me as beyond the pale." Now I'm sure, Mitch McConnell, he's ancient, he doesn't pay attention to any of this stuff. He's mostly just focused on making sure the Democrats don't accomplish anything and giving as much money to billionaires and corporations as possible. But look at what he is willing to allow along the way. Not just Trump's racism and all of that, but violent sexual threats against people in Congress with him. That's Mitch McConnell. Okay, thank you everybody for watching. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Damage Report. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, John Adarola. I'll see you soon.